Nobody was supposed to see it. The cameras were rolling, the audience was laughing, and somewhere in the back of the studio, something happened that CBS never meant to show America. The censors had checked everything. The producers had reviewed every single frame. But on that one night, something slipped right through. And when people rewound and looked again, they could not believe what they were seeing. What you are about to hear is the real story behind the most shocking moment in Smothers Brothers history. A moment so raw, so unplanned, and so dangerous that it changed television forever. And the crazy part? Nobody at CBS even knew it happened until it was too late. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand who these brothers really were. Because this story does not start in a TV studio. It starts with a tragedy that shaped two boys for the rest of their lives. Their father was Major Thomas B. Smothers Jr., a decorated Army officer. When Japan invaded the Philippines in 1941, Major Smothers was serving there. His wife Ruth and their young sons were sent away to safety. But the Major stayed behind. He was captured. He survived the horrific Bataan Death March, one of the most brutal forced marches in all of World War II. Then he was sent to a prison camp called Fukuoka No. 22, deep inside Japan. The conditions were terrible. Men were dying every single day. By April of 1945, the war was almost over. But the Major was too sick to keep working. On April 25th, he was moved from Fukuoka to Korea along with 110 other men. He never made it. Some records say he was buried at sea. Others say he was cremated in Korea. Of those 110 men who were transferred with him, only 36 survived. Major Smothers was the very last to die. He was never coming home. His wife Ruth was now alone with two little boys. Tom had been born in 1937. Dick came along in 1938. They grew up in California, while their mother worked long hours just to keep food on the table. Life was hard and painful, and that pain became the beating heart of everything they ever created together. The comedy started almost by accident. Back in college, Tom had put together a small musical group called the Casual Quintet. He played guitar. Dick taught himself bass just so he could join his brother. One by one, the other members drifted away. But Tom and Dick kept playing. They started telling jokes between songs just to fill the silence. That was the moment everything changed. The crowd started laughing. Not at the music, at the brothers, at the way they picked on each other, at the way Tom looked so innocent and Dick looked so annoyed. It felt real because it was real. That brotherly chemistry caught fire in 1959 at a small club in San Francisco called the Purple Onion. They were booked for just 2 weeks. But audiences loved them so much that they stayed for 36 weeks straight. Just months before, they had been earning about $2 a night. By the end of that run, they were making $2,000 a week. Their first album came out in 1961 and launched their career into orbit. On stage, Tom always played the lovable fool. Dick played the straight man. Tom would look at the crowd with those wide, innocent eyes and say something like, "Mom always liked you best." And the whole room would fall apart laughing. It did not feel like a bit. It felt like you were peeking through a window into their real lives. And that is exactly what made people fall in love with them. By the mid-1960s, CBS was in serious trouble. On Sunday nights, NBC show Bonanza was absolutely crushing everything the network put up against it. Bonanza was pulling in a quarter of all American TV viewers. It had already destroyed 2 popular CBS shows. The network was desperate. They needed something bold. They needed something young and different. They turned to the Smothers Brothers. But here is where Tom Smothers made a move that most people do not know about. Before agreeing to do the show, he asked CBS for total creative control. And CBS, because they were desperate for a hit, said yes. That single agreement would lead to one of the most famous battles in the history of American television. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour premiered on February 5, 1967. On the surface, it looked like just another variety show. Ed Sullivan himself introduced them as regular All-American kids. But within just a few episodes, everyone watching at home could see these boys were anything but regular. They joked about the Vietnam War. They made fun of politicians right to their faces. They talked about things that other TV shows would never touch. Their comedy had teeth, and it drew blood. Within 2 weeks, they beat Bonanza in the ratings. 2 weeks. The show that had destroyed everything in its path on Sunday nights was now sitting behind two brothers from California who made jokes about war and politics. Advertisers were excited. Younger viewers were thrilled. CBS was quietly terrified. Because while the ratings were soaring, the phone calls were coming in too. Angry sponsors, nervous executives, and according to people close to the show, even President Lyndon B. Johnson himself picked up the phone and called CBS, furious about how the brothers were portraying him on national television. The story goes that Johnson was so upset he stayed up until 3 in the morning making calls to demand the network rein the brothers in. Nixon would later push even harder to get them pulled off the air entirely. CBS fought back the only way a powerful network knows how. They assigned censors to watch every single second of tape before anything aired. Every word, every joke, every song lyric, every guest appearance. It all had to pass through a team of reviewers whose job was to sand down anything sharp, anything risky, anything that might upset the government or scare off sponsors. The deadline was strict. Tapes had to be submitted 10 full days before the show aired. The writers felt like they were drowning. They would write something brilliant, submit it, get it cut to pieces, rewrite it, resubmit it, get more things cut. And then sometimes CBS would demand changes just hours before the show went live. The writing team joked that it felt like death by 1,000 cuts. But they kept going. And the names on that writing team are stunning when you look back at them now. Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, Lorne Michaels. These were young writers who were just starting out, learning their craft in the chaos of the Smothers Brothers show. Their work there shaped everything that came after, from Saturday Night Live to All in the Family to the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Tom Smothers refused to give in quietly. He turned censorship itself into comedy. He created a sketch where he played a network censor chopping up scripts with giant scissors, cutting performers off mid-sentence, leaving nothing but total silence on screen. The message was clear. But CBS did not see the humor. They refused to air the sketch. Internal memos from the network said the skit was too damaging to their image. Even making fun of censorship was now being censored. And then came the guests. The Smothers Brothers invited people onto their stage that no other show in America would touch. Pete Seeger had been banned from television for nearly 17 years because of his anti-war views. Tom brought him on anyway and let him sing. CBS cut the performance before it aired the first time around. But Tom went straight to the press and told the whole story. The public was furious. The backlash was so intense that CBS was forced to let Seeger come back. On February 25, 1968, millions of Americans finally watched him perform the song uncensored. It was the first time a blacklisted artist had stood on national television and directly called out a sitting president. Joan Baez appeared on the show to dedicate a song to her husband David Harris, who was going to prison for 3 years after refusing the Vietnam War draft. CBS cut most of what she said, leaving only a vague mumble before she began to sing. Harry Belafonte performed a powerful piece, while footage of police beating anti-war protesters at the Democratic National Convention played in the background. CBS pulled the entire segment. Then, in a move that still shocks people today, they sold the 5 minutes of airtime they had cut to the Republican Party for campaign advertising. A protest against political violence became a Republican campaign ad. The brothers were beyond furious. The show also gave a stage to rock bands that mainstream television considered too wild, too loud, and too dangerous. Jefferson Airplane sang Crown of Creation, a song about nuclear war. Buffalo Springfield played For What It's Worth. Steppenwolf brought Born to Be Wild into living rooms across America. The Doors performed Touch Me with a full orchestra. And then there was The Who. Now here is where we arrive at that moment. The moment that nobody was supposed to see. The scene that was never edited. The one you have to look at again to believe. On September 17, 1967, The Who took the stage on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour to perform My Generation. drummer Keith Moon had a plan that not one single person in that building knew about. Not his bandmates. Not the producers. Not the directors. Nobody. Moon had secretly packed his kick drum with explosives. Way more than anyone had ever used on a television stage before. He had planned the perfect finale. Loud. Chaotic. Completely unforgettable. When the final moment of the song hit, the explosives went off. The blast was enormous. Smoke and debris exploded across the stage. A piece of shrapnel from a smashed cymbal flew through the air and hit Moon himself, knocking him backward off his stool. The force of the explosion blew Pete Townshend's hair straight up in a wild mess. The crowd went completely silent before erupting into screaming. In that frozen moment of chaos and smoke, something happened in the background that the cameras were never supposed to catch. CBS had reviewed the tape. The producers had checked the performance. But in the smoke and the confusion and the madness of that explosion, the cameras caught something real, something unplanned, something that proved what everyone had long suspected about how far this show was really willing to go. The scene was never edited. It was never cut. It went right out to the American public. And then, as if the explosion was not enough, Townsend walked through the smoke, grabbed Tom Smothers' acoustic guitar that was sitting on the stage, and smashed it to pieces right there in front of everyone. Tom Smothers just stood there staring with his mouth open, too shocked to even speak. Parents watching at home were horrified. Kids watching at home thought it was the greatest thing they had ever seen in their lives. It was a true generational split, right there on a Sunday night on CBS. The damage to Townsend was serious and lasting. He lost nearly 90% of the hearing in one ear. The ringing never stopped. Years later, he still talked about the constant pain and how difficult it made playing guitar for the rest of his career. The explosion that Keith Moon planned as a perfect spectacle became one of the most costly moments in rock and roll history. Jimi Hendrix never forgot what the brothers did. On April 26, 1969, at the Los Angeles Forum, Hendrix paused before one of his songs and dedicated his entire performance to the Smothers Brothers. He called them heroes for giving art and protest a place to live together on television. The show had just been canceled by CBS days before, but Hendrix stood on that stage and made sure everyone knew it mattered. CBS canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour on April 4, 1969. The official excuse was that the brothers had failed to submit a tape on time. But the show was still one of the top 10 most watched programs in all of America. It had just been renewed for another season. Everyone who was paying attention knew the real reason. The brothers had been too honest, too brave, too willing to say the things that powerful people did not want said on national television. Tom and Dick fought back in court. They sued CBS for breach of contract and spent 4 years battling. In April of 1973, they won. The judge awarded them $776,300, which would be worth over $5 million today. The ruling set a legal precedent that a network could not use censorship as a cover for cancellation. It was a landmark victory for free speech on American television. But as Tom would later say, they won the lawsuit and lost the culture war. The platform was gone. The moment had passed. Television had moved on. CBS replaced their show with Hee Haw, a wholesome country comedy with no politics, no controversy, and no sharp edges. It ran for 23 seasons. Their archive now lives at UC Santa Barbara, accepted by the university's Performing Arts Collection in the fall of 2022. Contracts, legal papers, photos, music sheets, recordings. All of it preserved. A curator said it deserved a place alongside the Library of Congress. Before Saturday Night Live ever existed, before late-night comedy became political, before anyone else dared to say the things that needed to be said on national television, there were two brothers from California whose father never came home from the war. Two brothers who turned their pain into comedy, their comedy into protest, and their protest into history. Look again at that scene. The one that was never edited. Because what you are really seeing is the exact moment when television stopped being safe forever.